Good morning. My name is Susan Cosgrove, and I'll be your host for this episode of the live stream show, My Diabetes HQ Live. When managing your diabetes and taking care of your health, self-advocacy is a critical skill. It means knowing your needs and your rights and having the confidence to speak up for yourself. Today, our guests and panel will discuss your rights in the workplace, at school, in life, and share their best tips for making sure that your needs are met so you can thrive. Today's episode is coming up right now. You don't want to miss it. Stay tuned. Good morning, everyone. Before we begin, a gentle reminder, the content shared during our My Diabetes HQ Live broadcast are not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Always seek the advice of your physician or other qualified health provider with any questions you may have regarding your medical condition. This weekly broadcast is developed and produced by Cities Changing Diabetes volunteers in Houston and here in Philadelphia. Both cities are in the network of 27 cities working to improve diabetes prevention and care management around the world. You can learn more about Cities Changing Diabetes by going to citieschangingdiabetes.org. The purpose of this program is to help people with diabetes and their support teams, and today we are here to help you understand your rights and keep yourself safe. So I'm excited to introduce our guests for this morning. So first we have John Griffin, a disability rights attorney and former chair of the National Board of Directors of the American Diabetes Association and a managing partner at Merrick, Griffin & Knopp in Victoria, Texas. Good morning, John. Welcome to the show.
Morning. Good morning, everyone. Thanks, Susan.
Thanks for joining us. We're also joined this morning by fan favorite Reva Verma, the CEO of Reneka Digital. Good morning, Reva. Thanks for joining us again.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
And then finally, we're joined by Serena Valentine, CEO of Core Initiative, Houston-based nonprofit, and the Peer Support Program Coordinator for Cities Changing Diabetes Houston. Good morning, Serena.
Good morning.
So we have a great group of guests and panel for you this morning. John, Reva, and Serena all live with diabetes and are here to share their perspectives on how to navigate work, school, and life in general while managing their diabetes. So we're really excited to have all three of you with us today. So I want to kind of start by hearing you speak kind of from your lived experience and share a little bit about sort of each of your origin stories of your motivation and your passion for the work that you do around advocacy. So John, why don't we start with you? What motivated you to take up advocacy work and what keeps you excited about the work today?
Thanks, Susan. I got started when I had a younger sister, who was diagnosed with type 1 gestational diabetes and then got diabetes, and her second-born daughter had diabetes when she was 3. Shortly thereafter, a young man came into my law office working for UPS who had been taken off of his truck and placed in a part-time clerk position because he was forced to go on insulin. And when he told his story of going months and months without insulin and having very, very high blood sugars, that he was forced between being fired or going on, if he went on insulin, or his health if he didn't. And finally, he ended up DKA at a hospital. And afterward, they removed him when he went on insulin. And my heart went out to him, given my life experience with my sister and my niece. Mm-hmm. And I got educated on diabetes and assisted him with his case with UPS. Fortunately, UPS no longer bans people with diabetes on their package cars, which is good. But we had a good resolution of that case, and that got me on the train of representing people with diabetes and helping them. And then I got recruited into the movement by an endocrinologist in San Antonio, Ralph DeFranzo, who recruited me and said the ADA doesn't just need doctors, they need lawyers too. The rest is history. 2 years later, I myself was diagnosed with diabetes. A year or so after that, I went on insulin. So I became part of the group I was assisting. So that's what makes me passionate about diabetes. And it also, what keeps me going is there's always new frontiers. There's always things we're trying to do. And as some of you may know, commercial pilots now don't have to get fired from the cockpit when they go on insulin. We have emergency responders for hurricanes now that we're opening doors even as we speak to make sure no job is off limits for people with diabetes.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, John, and thanks for everything that you've done personally to advance kind of the rights of people with diabetes. That's great. And I love what you said kind of about that endocrinologist telling you, we don't just need doctors, like almost thinking about advocates and lawyers as kind of part of the care team for people who have diabetes that help them take care of themselves. So Reva, I'd like to go to you next and would love to hear kind of how you got involved in this work.
Hi, so I was diagnosed with diabetes, type 1 diabetes, when I was 11 years old. So I've been living with diabetes for over 17 years. I got involved with the American Diabetes Association around the time of my diagnosis and was given access to different mentors and to understand their stories as to their struggles with diabetes and their opportunities with diabetes. And from there, I got involved with what's called Call to Congress. It's an initiative through the American Diabetes Association where we actually go to Congress, we speak to our representatives, we speak about issues and ask for support. So that is my involvement with the American Diabetes Association and how I got so involved. And John took me under his wing and kind of let me tell my story, talk about insulin, talk about accommodations for school and work. So it's been a process, but we've made great progress in the past few years.
Yeah, thanks, Reva. I feel like storytelling is such an important part of this work of advocacy and of advocating for yourself. So Serena, do you have anything to add? Would love to hear your story.
Yeah, sure. So I've been living with diabetes for almost 17 years as well. When I was diagnosed, it was very unexpected. I was in college and didn't really know too much about diabetes. And along the way, years after that, it's like I came into a lot of roadblocks because of just things that I did not know. And so my passion incited with my own experience of not knowing. Ignorance will make you have to go through things that you really shouldn't have to go through. And so I'm passionate about educating people with diabetes on how to manage and what diabetes is. So I started a nonprofit organization, and we're geared towards health education. And I started with diabetes because that's where I am. So then I got involved with CCD, Cities Changing Diabetes, and started with the faith and diabetes work, educating people in your own congregations about diabetes. And then I got onto peer support. So in peer support, we help people learn how to advocate for themselves because actually you are your best advocate. You know your body, you know your situation like no one else could know. And so that's what gets me passionate about helping other people because some people just don't know. You can't help yourself if you don't know. So lack of knowledge has incited my passion.
That's great. And certainly peer support plays a huge role in kind of self-advocacy and learning in that educational path. So I want to move on to our next question, which is, we know that about 1 in 10 people in America is living with diabetes, and many, if not most people living with diabetes are managing their condition while working full or part-time. They might be hourly, they might be a shift worker, they might be salaried, really kind of all, represented in all levels of employment. And so I want to talk about what people living with diabetes should know about their rights in the workplace. And John, I'm going to kick it over to you first again. Could you start by telling us which laws protect a person who's living with diabetes and working at the same time?
Certainly. Most of us are familiar with the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act, that was first signed by the first President Bush. That act applies to most private businesses, and it also applies to most venues and where people need access and protections in public places. The Rehabilitation Act and the Congressional Accountability Act apply to fewer people, but they apply to governmental employees. but the ADA and the Rehab Act and the CAA are all similar in their provisions.
Great. And so, I mean, I guess we should back up a little bit and just kind of talk about, defining what is a disability and kind of whether diabetes qualifies as a disability if you're thinking about accommodations within the workplace.
Sure. Today, we can be grateful that the Americans with Disabilities Act now protects people with diabetes. 10 years ago, for years, people with diabetes, the better we did managing our diabetes, the less protections we had under the ADA. And so people with diabetes are normally per se, or that is, have a disability because diabetes has an effect on a major life activity, which in our case is our endocrine function. That is, our pancreas and liver don't work together like people who don't have diabetes. And so diabetes is what we call an actual disability. The two other ways people have disabilities don't apply so much for accommodations, but in employment discrimination. If an employer has a record or a paper that says a person has a serious problem, that too can be a source of discrimination. And where an employer treats a person as having a condition that's worse than it really is, that too is protected. But for accommodations, in order to get an accommodation in any way, we have to have an actual disability. And diabetes normally is such a disability because the way it impairs or affects our endocrine system.
Yeah, thanks for that comprehensive definition. And I think with that, we'll talk a little bit about reasonable accommodations. And John, would love to have you start, and then we'll hear from Reva and Serena on this as well. But what is a reasonable accommodation for a person who's living with diabetes?
Well, that's a great question, Susan. All of us are different. Everybody's diabetes is different. We manage it differently. Our needs are different. But what an accommodation is some sort of variation or a change to a policy, rule, or the way things are normally done that allows those of us with diabetes and disabilities to have this, to enjoy the same privileges, employments in our jobs, the same way people who don't have disabilities enjoy them. Sometimes they help us want to manage our diabetes if we need some time off to get retooled on our carb counting or our insulin administration. All of those kinds of things are usually a variation in some sort of rule. And even if the rule is so minor as no food at your desk, that's the kind of rule that should be modified for a person with diabetes, because we need carbohydrates. At least a lot of us with diabetes need that sort of accommodation at work. So everything is different, but the first thing we have to do is to be able to say we have diabetes, we have a disability. And that's a challenge for some of us, because we lived in a world for so long where none of us wanted to disclose that we have diabetes at all for fear of what would happen to us, that we would be marginalized and treated as some sort of damaged goods and discriminated against. And today, there's no reason that we're required to tell an employer we have diabetes, and it's unlawful for an employer to ask us if we have a disability. But at the same time, when we need an accommodation, we have to tell the employer we need an accommodation because I have diabetes, and start that good faith process.
Lots of really important points there, John. I think including the fact that an employer cannot ask you if you have a disability or if you have diabetes. I think that's really critical. And we'll talk a little bit more about kind of how to manage the stigma or sort of the feelings that can come up when someone is thinking about, whether they need to disclose. But I want to kind of take this concept of reasonable accommodations. I think you gave a great example around, if you're not allowed to have food at your desk, like clearly you need to be able to do that. But Serena, would love for you to weigh in about different ways or different tactics that you've used or things that you've asked for to help just make it easier for you to kind of manage your diabetes while working. What do you do to take care of yourself?
Well, now I work for myself, but when I was working jobs in college and everything, I always had to ask for my breaks to make sure I get my breaks, even if it might have been frowned upon to take a quick break. A lot of times when most people take breaks, they break. when I had to take a break, I had to go check my blood sugar, I had to go take insulin shot, or I had to go take medicine, or I just needed time to breathe because, you know, I felt a little winded or a little lightheaded or something like that, and just needed to breathe, get some fresh air. So, of course, I always went to my immediate supervisor. I'm a person about protocol. Love protocol. But because it's important, you know, you don't want to, you know, kind of force yourself anywhere like you're up with your fists all the time. You don't want to do that. You know, you don't want to upset too many people. But I always go to my immediate supervisor. If that didn't help, I would go to manager, depending on what the hierarchy of the workplace was. And if I didn't get any help there, I'd go to HR. But that's me. I'm not going to tell you. We need to talk to John about that. I'm not going to tell you that is just the right way to do it every time. But from my own experience, that's how I did it. And there have been times where I've had emergency situations where I just had to do it anyway. I had to take my break anyway, because if I didn't, they would have had to call 911 for me. So it was a quick response that I had to have during that time.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Serena. And I think it's important too to note that there are a lot of different approaches to this. As you said, you know, like you figured out the way that works really well for you, and for other people, depending on their work environment, depending on their personality, you know, they might need to take a slightly different approach. So Reva, would love for you to weigh in here about kind of accommodations and what helps you kind of in the workplace. And I believe that you're also currently self-employed. So what would you want to extend to kind of employees or coworkers?
So like Serena said, it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. You know, and like you pointed out, everyone has different personalities. As an employer myself, I would want someone to feel comfortable knowing that they can take breaks, that they can take off work for going to doctor's appointments, as long as, you know, they're almost keeping me in the loop in some way. They don't have to tell me the details, but I would like to almost feel part of that support system for someone, because that's the type of environment I would appreciate. For example, I work at contract sites. I contract myself out. I have talked to my team over there about, look, I have type 1 diabetes. Sometimes I need to take off for appointments. Sometimes, you know, a site comes out and I need to take a break and I need to go change my site. Hey, if I'm in a meeting, don't be offended, because maybe I'm just checking my sensor reading on my phone. Just keeping people in the loop. Communication normally minimizes all conflict or tension that you may feel.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point about just the importance of communication here. So we have a great question in the comments that I want to highlight. And John, I think I'm going to direct this at you, but there's a question from Marianne. If diabetes is well controlled, is it still covered by the Americans with Disabilities Act? And I think you kind of touched on this a little bit, but could you elaborate?
Yes, that's a great question, because it takes us back in time when we were not protected, when we were well managed or well controlled. Now Congress in 2008, thanks to lots of volunteers in the diabetes community and our brothers and sisters in the cancer community and the heart community, we now define a disability when it's not controlled. That is, when it's not when we don't use medications, when we don't use diet, when we don't use insulin, when we don't use the tools of management. We take people in an uncontrolled state to define whether they have a disability at all. And whether it's type 2 or type 1, we have an impairment in the endocrine system when we're not being taken care of. And as long as that's the case, we're protected under the ADA Amendments Act that was signed by the second President Bush in 2008, which I believe was the only civil rights bill that he signed in his 8 years in office. So we're very proud of that. The Democrats and Republicans worked together. I think it was 423-3 to get the act amended to protect virtually all people with diabetes and epilepsy, no matter how well they are managed.
That's great information, and I think a really important point. So I'm going to move on to another question that we've kind of touched on a little bit, but I want to talk about the decision of whether to tell or disclose to your employer that you have diabetes. And I think this is something that can be really hard for people. It may be the only way to get the accommodations that you need, but it can also come with stigma, shame, or even worry that your job will be affected. So what tips do you have for viewers who are considering having this conversation? And Reva, I want to start with you since you kind of ended your last point on communication and the importance of communication. What would you offer to our viewers on disclosure?
I would say if you have a letter from your doctor that you want to present to your employer, or if you just want to set up a private one-on-one with your employer with just a quick cheat sheet of, hey, I might need these accommodations, that's a quick and easy way to just rip the Band-Aid off.
That's great. And John, are there any specific ways in which sort of that conversation should be documented? Like, should you have it in writing? As Reva mentioned, having kind of a list of the accommodations that you might need. Do you have any recommendations around how to do that and how it should be documented?
In terms of accommodations themselves, they should be documented in some form of an email or minutes from a meeting. There should be a paper trail of the accommodation process so that there's no argument about what happened. To your question about when people should tell their employer they have diabetes, I think that depends on each person. There are people with diabetes who are in positions where the diabetes does not affect their ability to work and they don't need an accommodation. And they are worried that sometimes what I call the Soviet-style bureaucracy of some of these governmental agencies and large companies, once they know you have diabetes, they will say, let's do a fitness for duty examination and send that person down the rat hole of spending 3 months just to prove what they already know, which is this person is a person with diabetes that does not have any real issues on the job or even in personal life. And so that said, many people in the workplace will have friends and associates they work with very closely that they do want their coworkers to know they have diabetes for various reasons. I'm going to go take a break to check my blood sugar. I'm going to go calibrate my pump. I'm going to go get some carbohydrates. Those are the kinds of things that are sort of decided by each person. So my sense of it is that a type A person like me, judges generally know very quickly that I have diabetes. And I usually they usually know because I have a CGM monitor and the courthouses don't allow electronic devices. So they know from the start, and I usually tell the judges, the court personnel, you probably won't notice anything about my diabetes. But if you see an electronic device, I'm just checking to see what my blood sugar is at that particular point in time. So my sense is that we are moving in a way that makes it more acceptable for someone to know we have diabetes. But at the same time, those of us who want to keep that to ourselves, so long as we're not asking for an accommodation, that should be the right of every person with diabetes in the world.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, John. And Serena, I want to ask you kind of what role peer support can play in helping people have these conversations too. Is it helpful to have somebody who's gone through this or can share how they approach it if you're thinking about doing this?
Oh, yes, most definitely. I always think of peer support as someone kind of not always holding you by the hand and taking you along, but kind of being like that little tour guide, So because when I was dealing with stuff, I didn't have a tour guide. I had to figure it out on my own. And sometimes I did things the right way, sometimes I didn't. So peer support, having a person that can talk to you or who has already been through it and can tell you how they did it, and then you can make your own decision on how you're going to advocate for yourself, especially in the workplace, that can be a really big help because some people, like John said, don't like to talk about it. They don't want to tell their employers. I'm one of those people too, John, that I'm going to tell you, okay, look, coming in, this is what I have going on. So if I do this, this is what's going on. If I do that, this is what's going on. Because when you keep the communication open, then it leaves out the people playing the guessing game of what's going on with you. But like I get a lot of people in peer support, they don't want to mention it. They don't want to talk about it. They want to keep it to themselves. So it is their right to keep it to themselves. I would just say, as a matter of safety, if you're feeling really sick and you really feeling really bad and you really have to check your blood sugar, you really have to go take your insulin or your medication, I think that it's important to tell someone, even if it's not your boss, a coworker, somebody who can kind of watch your back. But yeah, we talk about that a lot in peer support. It comes up all the time, all the time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks, Serena. And on the note of safety too, I see we have a comment in the chat that just says it should be stated in the law that if someone has diabetes or any serious medical condition, they should have some type of identity bracelet because it just might save their life. So I think certainly thinking about these different issues of safety, the identity bracelets, Serena, or you mentioned like telling a coworker so that they know what's going on with you. I think this is all really, really critical. So I want to mention another question that we have in the chat, which is, what advice do all of you have for clinicians regarding the content of medical letters for a person living with diabetes? So is there a standard form that you can give to your diabetes educator or to your clinician, or is this something more general that they can write? And what recommendations do you have? Do you want to start us off, John?
That's a very good question. What educators and physicians should put in a form depends a lot on what form the Soviet-style bureaucracy of the employer has in its form. A lot of times these are pre-populated forms. What we suggest, and having helped people with diabetes write hundreds of them, we want to stress, A, the person has diabetes, that they're living well with diabetes, and that this is the accommodation they need, and this is the benefit the accommodation will give them. The trick is, in those forms, is employers try to trip up people with diabetes by asking them, do you have any major limitations in any major life activities? The person is going to say, well, no, that's why I'm well managed. I have a good life. The employer then throws it in the trash can and says, you don't have a disability at all because you don't have any substantial limitation. The person filling out the form doesn't realize that endocrine function is listed as a major life activity, but it's not like talking, diving, breathing. It's a different kind of concept. And so my thought is that people should have the physician, whether it's on the Soviet style form or not, talk about what accommodation is sought, that they have diabetes, which is a disability, and what the accommodation, how it will benefit the patient, it seems to me.
Yeah, and as a follow-up to that, and thinking about sort of the complexity of some of these forms, the fact that they can vary from employer to employer, at what point in this process is it appropriate for somebody to engage a lawyer to walk them through? Is it later in the process? Is it earlier? What would you say, John?
I think it depends on the company. There are certain employers where I'm sad to say this, but for example, United States Postal Service, UPS was like this for a while. It almost was as if the person with diabetes almost needed counsel or someone with some legal expertise just to navigate through the forms to make sure they don't get tripped up. But I think that today is the exception to the rule. We work with employers all the time to have them ask the right question. What is your disability? Why do you need an accommodation, and how would it benefit you? Those are the three questions that employers ought to ask. And then there has to be, as under the law, a good faith, interactive dialogue with the goal of having an accommodation that works and that does not create an unreasonable or undue burden on the employer. And that's a challenge sometimes, given the employer's lack of experience, or tend to just marginalize people with disabilities and assume they can't do the job just because they're asking for an accommodation. most workers with diabetes who ask for an accommodation are doing a good job. They have good evaluations. They need a variation in something that allows them to enjoy the job and to manage their diabetes so that they have a working life like people who don't have diabetes or any other disability.
Yeah, thanks, John. So I want to ask a difficult question, which is, what should somebody do if they go through this process with their employer? You know, they're engaged in this good faith conversation. They list out the accommodations that they need, and then the employer does not take action, or those accommodations are not being met. You know, they're not kind of receiving what they need to do their job adequately. What's the right step to take in that difficult situation?
Well, my normal thought is they go to the EEOC and make a charge that the employer has failed in its duty to accommodate. Usually, before we go to the EEOC, we want to try to exhaust all of the avenues within the employer. That is, if there's an appeal process, an HR department, someone else that can be consulted with to allow them to sort of correct the action. So each company has a different way of doing it. They are employee handbooks. They sometimes they email. Sometimes you have to put it in writing. It's best to just give them the documentation that you need the accommodation and how it will benefit you, benefit someone at work. And then there's supposed to be this dialogue, whether you're sitting down virtually or sitting down personally. There should be a give and take, a discussion of what's needed and what the employer's objections are so that people can negotiate an accommodation that works for everybody. And if the employer ends up stonewalling or what we call just say no, that's the time for the EEOC to get involved. And I think today, I don't want to paint a negative picture of employers because I usually hear and am referred people only for employers who are not complying, who are giving people with diabetes a cold shoulder. And I think and believe that many employers have more progressive and compliant accommodation policies than others. And so it's important, though, to be able to show that you, the worker, or the person seeking accommodation in education or public access, did do the best we could in good faith to try to persuade this other entity to do the right thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that emphasizing that good faith aspect of this from both sides of the negotiation and the conversation is really critical. And we have another good question in the chat, which I think also reflects kind of the complicated relationship with your employer as also being your provider of health insurance and healthcare services. But Marianne asks, can an employer health insurance program require employees with diabetes to meet a specific A1C goal?
Well, I'll take that one first. No, they can't.
Okay. Simple answer.
No, everybody with diabetes has different A1C goals, and health insurance, at least under the Affordable Care Act, can't rate people according to what their A1C is. And so, fortunately, now it is not appropriate for employers' health insurance programs or insurance carriers to require people with diabetes to have a specific A1C.
Yeah, thanks, Marianne, for that question. I think that's a great one, especially as we see kind of, employer wellness programs also that are sort of sometimes like you can get like a bonus if you get a screening or a physical or something that has kind of your health information, and this increasingly fluid, I think, boundary between employers and their employees' health information. So good to know that absolutely not, your employer cannot impose a specific A1C goal on you if you are a person living with diabetes. So I want to shift a little bit just to talk about the process of applying for jobs when you have diabetes. So, how has it been for the three of you to apply for jobs, and was having diabetes an added stress factor when you were on the job market? And Serena, I want to start with you on this one. The knowing laugh.
Well, I can say about 90% of job applications I filled out do ask if you have a disability. And I have seen diabetes under that list on job applications. And so when I fill out mine, I do put that. Well, sometimes I did and sometimes I didn't, to be honest, because I just wasn't really sure how that was going to affect my chances of actually getting the position. So it is kind of an added stress a little bit in the sense of having a little anxiety about, okay, am I going to be able to get this if I do put I have diabetes on my application? The fact that I check yes, I have a disability, and you don't get to on the application, you don't get to say specifically diabetes. They just have a list of illnesses that fall under disability, and you just check disability yes, or no. So I think a little bit of the anxiety comes from, well, am I going to be able to get this job? Are they going to look down on me because I did check disability? But if I don't check disability and then I get there and I get the job and then I come to them with all these things I need, like what's going to happen? I'm one of those people, mind runs 50 miles ahead of time. And so my mind goes through those things. But yeah, sometimes it can get a little stressful.
Yeah, Raven, what has your experience been in applying for jobs and thinking about this?
I think my experience has been a little bit different. I haven't like I've said here, I work for myself. I did have jobs like in high school and college where I didn't necessarily have to disclose that I had diabetes off the bat. It was more, in third round interviews when you're finalizing the deal, whether you like when the employer asks you, are there things that you would like us to know? Are there accommodations you need? And that's when I would disclose that I had diabetes and I would need additional accommodations. So yeah, I think that I'm kind of the oddball here. I haven't necessarily had to think about disclosing that on an application per se.
Mm-hmm. And John, I want to ask you, to Serena's point about the anxiety, like when you see that on an application, and I've seen that on job applications too, do you identify as the person with a disability? How can an employer use that information when you're applying for a job?
They cannot. It's unlawful before a person is offered a job to inquire or to have a box on the form that asks if you have diabetes or disability. That is absolutely 100% contrary to the law. They could be sued for that. It's disappointing there are still employers who inquire about disabilities before a person gets a job. And so my thought is that if people are forced or feel like they're forced, there's no good easy answer. Many people will mark no because it's an illegal question, because there's no telling what an employer who puts that on the form will do when they see the person writes down, yes, I have a disability, it's diabetes, and what can of worms that open, because it could keep them from getting the job. I can identify with that. I am a scuba diver, and when I first became certified, or when I got re-upped one time, the many scuba people would not allow you to scuba dive if you had diabetes, and I was put between. If I wanted to dive, I would put no disability, no nothing. That made me somewhat uncomfortable many years ago. I can't be prosecuted for it now. It's been too long ago. But the choice was either know what your blood sugar is, dive, and keep it from the people who are doing the dive. Or now I do tell the truth, because thanks to efforts of ADA volunteers and others around the world, that Patty and the other dive organizations no longer discriminate. They just take precautions to make sure you've had a finger stick or have a blood glucose reading before you dive, to make sure that you check when you're finished diving, and to make sure nobody's in a danger position of having a low blood sugar while diving. So my thought is applications for virtually any job should not have it on the form. And if they do, someone should know at the employer that is unlawful, because we're trying to pull up those weeds one at a time and get our country where nobody's asked about a disability before they get a job.
Mm-hmm. That's really helpful to know that that really should not be something that's on a form at all. And thank you also for bringing up, just the difficult position that that puts people in, where you feel like, should I answer this? If it's an online form, sometimes it won't even let you go to the next phase of the form.
Right.
It'll give you that alert that says you haven't completed it, or lie. And nobody wants to be put in that position where they have to make that choice. So I think it is good to know that people really shouldn't be asking about that. If you get asked about it and you're comfortable, maybe after the application process is closed, saying to that employer, hey, you really shouldn't be asking about this. And I think we have a related question from Klaus in the chat, which is just, during your interview, can an employer ask follow-up questions? So we've talked about how you don't have to disclose. They really shouldn't be asking you in the application process. But if you voluntarily reveal that you have diabetes, can the employer ask you follow-up questions during an interview process?
Well, that's a very good question. Once a person volunteers that they have diabetes, I would ask myself and others, what are we trying to communicate to the employer by telling them that before we have the job? So my thought is that an employer does not violate the statute by following up on something that a person with a disability has volunteered. That conversation normally, though, should happen after the job offer. If the employer has, for example, public safety positions, airline pilots, bus drivers, they have a fitness for duty process, which they identify potential conditions that might impact safety. But they can only do that after the person is offered the job. And then they can do it, then there will be that conversation. But my thought is that if a person volunteers to the employer that they have diabetes during a job interview, that it's not a per se violation for the employer to merely follow up by asking questions. But I think we all ought to be very careful and thoughtful about why we would tell an interviewer with the company that we have diabetes. And if we do, we should be ready to explain why that's important to us and why we're sharing it, perhaps for accommodation purposes, perhaps for some of us to say, look how well people with diabetes can live. I want to be an ambassador for, the 30, 35 million kids and adults with diabetes. Some people feel that way. I sometimes do. So that's up to the person, I think.
Mm-hmm. And Serena, I think you mentioned specifically that that's often the phase in the process where you would bring this up, is more kind of towards the end of the process, like at the offer stage or something. That would be a good point in time to have this conversation about kind of what you need. So I want to shift a little bit to make sure that we just talk a little bit about kind of navigating the school system. So we've been talking a lot about the workplace, but we know that for young people with diabetes and their parents, navigating the school system requires self-advocacy skills. So Reva, I know you have personal experience with this, so I'd like to start with you, if you could share a little bit what that was like and what worked well and maybe what didn't work so well for you.
Okay, great. So I was diagnosed at the end of 5th grade, going into the 6th grade. I went to a local public school for 6th grade, and a story that really resonates after talking about this is that I was sitting in the cafeteria about to give myself an insulin shot, and someone went and reported me to one of the staff and said that I was taking drugs. So after that, I was told that I couldn't give myself insulin shots in public. So I would have to go to the nurse's office. So that required a different level of advocacy where we had to talk with the nurses. We had to talk with my teachers. I had to end up talking to, it was all about self-advocacy, asking for accommodations in class, carrying snacks with me, carrying juice with me. It caused a lot of stress as a young child, and I'm thankful that things have gotten a lot better because now teachers have the ability to look at children's sensors. So back when I was in school, I would have to walk all the way to the nurse's office in order to get something. Now that's not the case. You can carry all of that with you without going through the loopholes that I had to. Then you fast forward to 7th grade. I missed out on an educational opportunity. The class went on a field trip, and on the last day of the trip, they were going through caves. The school didn't feel comfortable taking on the liability of having me hike through those caves. So that required my parents coming and picking me up early. So we had to talk with the staff later about how that wasn't a fair ask, how things are improving. I'm a well-managed diabetic, and that, things needed to be put in place for further field trips. From then on, they started bringing the nurse on the trips, and I was able to stay on the annual field trips throughout. So that was a great improvement. Then in high school, some education needed to be provided around acknowledging that this was a disability, and I needed test accommodations so that, because when I was stressed out, my blood sugar would rise, and I had huge test anxiety. So providing me a little bit extra time to take my tests helped with keeping my blood sugars in a more stable range so that I could perform at optimal level. Then you fast forward to sports, a whole different aspect of the education process where you're learning to, work with other people, be competitive. That was kind of a downer because I didn't want to be taken off the field, but if my blood sugar would drop or I would have a high that prevented me from playing in the soccer game, that was education needed to be provided to my teammates, to my coach, to look out for certain symptoms so that we could all be in a safe environment. Then in college, something that was a very formalized process that I had not been used to, but was educational for me. And I ended up being able to share that with other support groups at college, was that you can go to the disabilities office, take a letter from your doctor, and ask for accommodations as far as tests go, being able to go to a private room, have a little extra time, work with your teachers in a different manner to alleviate stress, because stress is a huge factor in blood sugar management. So all of those tips and tricks came from, like Serena mentioned, just personal experience. When you go through it, you're able to share that knowledge with other people. So we had a diabetes chapter at TCU, and we would talk about our experiences, and a lot of people didn't know that they could ask for those types of accommodations, but that it was a formalized process. And what's important to note is that even if you get that that acceptance from the disabilities office, you still have to take that letter to each professor and have that conversation with them and get them to acknowledge that you've provided this documentation and have them sign off on it.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Reva, kind of throughout, the different phases of your educational life, how you've had to ask for accommodations and get them. And I just want to highlight that we've talked a little bit about how, disclosing can put you in a position to be like an ambassador or an educator, both for your employer, for your school system, for your peers. And I think that can be a little bit challenging. It can be a really empowering role. Sometimes you can really feel like, yes, I'm ready to take this on today. And I think sometimes you can also feel like you roll out of bed and you're like, I don't want to do this again today. I don't want to have to be in this role. And so I just want to give a lot of credit to all of you and to everybody out there who's managing their diabetes and really balancing that role of ambassador, educator, self-advocate, not only making sure that you are cared for yourself, but also, as you say, creating this pathway so that in the future, as we've heard, over the past several decades, things have gotten easier for people with diabetes. And I think that's largely because of the work and the lived experience that all of you have, which is great. So I want to just come back to a couple more questions that we have in the chat. So there's a question specifically from Marianne about truck drivers, which I think is a specific profession where maybe there were some limitations in the past. But Marianne asks, are interstate truck drivers allowed to continue in their career if they have to go on insulin or if they're diagnosed with diabetes?
That's an easy one. Yes, absolutely. For decades, they could not. But thanks to a lot of work in Congress with the FMCSA and other federal agencies, now people can get interstate truck driving licenses and DOT cards to drive commercial trucks or any other kind of trucks, so long as their diabetes is managed where they're not deemed to be unsafe in some way driving. So that was a decade-long effort by diabetes volunteers across the country, in the Congress and at the FMCSA and the DOT. But yeah, they can continue their careers, and that's one of the reasons why we keep doing what we're doing, because those doors, every door that's open for a person with diabetes makes our country better, and actually we found makes our roads safer, because people who are well-managed people with diabetes are generally safer drivers than everybody else combined.
That's great to know. And I think on that note of why you keep doing what you're doing, we've talked a lot about the progress that's been made, but would love to hear, what are you still advocating for? Or if we invite you back, to MyDiabetesHQ Live in 10 years, what advances would you like to be touting then, that have happened between now and then? So what are you still working towards?
Well, a dream we had is that no young man or woman be denied their opportunity to serve in the military with diabetes. That's been a longer journey, but we really thought that we wouldn't ever have pilots either, but we do. And so when you see these kinds of developments, they sort of bring tears to my eyes, because of things that we could only dream of, they can occur. And there are efforts being made with our military to demonstrate that people have served with diabetes below the radar, with nobody knowing it, and doing wonderful things, and that they too should not be banned simply because they have diabetes. And so I would like to be able to celebrate 10 years from now that no one be automatically excluded from the military simply because they have diabetes or they have diabetes treated with insulin.
That's great. Reva, I want to kick it to you. Kind of what would you like to see happen in advocacy over the next 10 years?
I would like for people to just feel more comfortable sharing that they do live with diabetes, and feel, that it's not a burden, and that they will not be left out on opportunities that they would exceed at. That would be my hope.
Great. And Serena, anything you'd like to add?
Yes, I actually would like to see people take diabetes more seriously, because I hear a lot, so much in peer support that, well, my grandma had it, my aunt had it, my uncles had it, my brother had it, my sister had it. It's like everybody had it, so it's okay. I gotta die someday. Like, you can still live a healthy life with diabetes. It's hard work. It definitely is hard work, but you can survive. And so, I would just like to see more people take it seriously, and that's on all levels, at government level and on a personal level, in every arena that we could think of. So, yeah.
That's great. That's great. So in our final few minutes here, I just want to ask if there are any resources that the three of you would like to highlight. What resources do you recommend to our viewers to help with understanding their rights and advocating for themselves or their family members?
Peer support. Shameless plug. Okay, everybody, if you are on Facebook, and if you are dealing with diabetes, it could be pre-diabetes, type 1, type 2, or gestational diabetes, or you're a caregiver to someone dealing with diabetes, please go to Houston Diabetes Peer Support. And we have a Facebook group online. click to request a membership, and one of our admins will admit you. We talk about everything. If we can't answer questions such as, you know, specific medical questions, we will direct you to people who can. Shameless plug.
Serena, how many people do you have in the peer support group now?
Now I believe it's like 124.
Yeah.
And so it was like 80 something before we started MyDiabetes HQ, and now we have increased, and we're still increasing. Like it's the group is getting bigger, and so I'm so excited about that.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah.
John, any resources that you would like to highlight?
Well, there for accommodations, the Job Accommodation Network, JAN, is a great resource, and it's free. And they have lawyers, the peer support people who actually, it's a nonprofit that all they do is answer questions around the country about accommodations. The ADA has, I think, still on its website, lots of good resources for workers and lawyers about diabetes specific related accommodations. Those are two very, very good resources for people seeking accommodations in the workplace, for sure.
That's great. And Reva, any additional resources that you would like to add, or sources that have been helpful to you?
I'll just piggyback off of John and say, you know, the American Diabetes Association has a lot of resources for people living with diabetes. They have templates on their websites. They have email templates. They have print-off forms. They have a list of resources for you to reach out for issue-specific needs. So it's a great resource to leverage.
And Reva, I want to come back to something you brought up kind of in our intro, which is if somebody wants to get involved with more like national level advocacy, do you have any recommendations for how somebody could get involved there?
Yes, so the American Diabetes Association has an initiative called Call to Congress. With the COVID situation, that this year it was not in person, but we did have ways virtually you could get involved. So that entailed calling your Congress members, sending emails, having a community that you could rely on to talk about these issues. But if you do want to get involved in future events for Call to Congress, there's a lot of information on the American Diabetes Association website. You can also reach out to your local chapters for more information.
Great, thank you. So I just want to end by giving each of our guests a chance to share their final words of wisdom on self-advocacy for our viewers. So Serena, let's start with you.
Okay, well, you are your best advocate. Okay, you know your situation like no one else does, even the things you don't tell. So you need to advocate for what you need. Make sure that you communicate as much as you would like, but please do communicate it, because you don't want people to get the wrong idea about what's going on with you, and that starts a whole bunch of other drama and trouble. Just, you know, advocate for yourself. You're the best one to do it. That's all I can say about that.
Thanks, Serena. Reva, what words of wisdom do you have for our viewers to end on today?
It's really hard to come after Serena. She nailed it. You are your best self-advocate. No one knows your situation better than you do. And, you know, I would just like to empower people. Feel free to express what you need. If you don't ask for help, if you don't disclose what you need, people can't know, people can't help, people can't accommodate. So the more you communicate, the better off you will be.
That's great. And John, we'll give you the final word this morning.
Well, I think it's hard to follow, but I think we all are our best advocates. At the same time, I find myself not needing to advocate for myself very much because of how much benefit that I get from helping to advocate for others. And so all of us probably know someone with insulin-treated diabetes, whether it's a young adult or a teenager or someone having a difficult time, to advocate for them, to intervene with them, to help them to be a better person in terms of managing their diabetes, because that does lower stress. It makes us better advocates to be able to understand why some of our brothers and sisters with diabetes are undergoing difficult times. because it is still a ravaging, terrible disease, and it has a terrible effect on people who are bright, who are otherwise very successful in the world. So serving others helps make us better advocates for ourselves and everybody else.
Yes,
That's great.
yes, I
It's
agree.
a great note to end on. So I want to say thank you, Reva, Serena, and John, for joining us this morning. This has been a really wonderful conversation. It's been a great start to the weekend. And thank you to our viewers as well. We hope this conversation has helped you understand your rights and feel confident advocating for yourself. And remember, as everybody has said, you are your best self-advocate, and everything that you do to take care of yourself is an act of self-advocacy and a success worth celebrating. So to our viewers, please mark your calendars. We'll be back next week and broadcasting every Saturday, 10 a.m. Central Time and 11 a.m. Eastern Time. Our next episode will air next Saturday, October 17th. Thanks so much for being part of the My Diabetes HQ community, and we will see you next time. Thanks.